And I'm happy to introduce this third set of lectures. But before I do so, I want to introduce a special guest, Cynthia Assel. And she is the editor of Progressive Christian Magazine, which is one of the sponsors of this event. I'm going to let you introduce the publication.
Thank you, Paige. It's a pleasure to be with you. And if you're as much of a church groupie as I am, you're just kind of bouncing up and down in your seats right now, right? It's like, this is so cool. Oh, my gosh. The Progressive Christian is actually 187 years old. It began life as a magazine called Zion's Herald, which was a journal of the abolition movement. And through its century, almost 2 centuries now, it has been a bastion of discussion about civil rights and women's rights and labor rights and some very deep theological questions. And I think we've gotten some of those this weekend. I want to do a quick, since this is a very interactive seminar, I want to do a quick interaction here. How many people here, how many of us know someone who has lost their job in the last 2 years because of the recession, okay? How many of us know someone who has endured foreclosure because of the recession? How many of us know someone who has gone into personal bankruptcy because of the economic situation? Okay, now see, at this point, all of you can raise your hand because you're looking at one. Starting at the end of 2008, our magazine was no longer able to pay me. And I've been continuing on as a volunteer because I believe in the mission. We desperately need to amplify the progressive Christian voice in this country. And I want to tell you one thing. Our bankruptcy was filed in February, and it was discharged in June of this year. And since that discharge, we have been literally flooded, my husband and I, with paper mail and advertisements and email from people who are telling us that the way to restore our financial credibility is to go back into debt. Now, I hope that each of you can keep the image of one person in your mind as we continue through these wonderful lectures. Think about someone you know who's lost a job. Think about someone you know who's lost their house, who's lost their health insurance. This is not just their tragedy. It is all our tragedies because it is breaking down the fabric of our community. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you continue to enjoy this weekend.
We're going to move into a time of conversation about the Apostle Paul, which is so appropriate. He takes up half the New Testament with letters that he wrote or are attested to him, and the story of the spread of the early church in the book of Acts. For most of us, Paul is a puzzling character, so passionate about Christ, can't believe people are not going to buy into Christ, assumes that everyone will eventually. And he'll write these beautiful visions of all of us, one body and one spirit, Christ in all, through all, above all. And then one chapter later in Ephesians, he's saying something like, wives, be subject to your husbands. And you think, why did you have to go there? It was going so well. And then you look at Romans, and there'll be this long list of things that you shouldn't do if you want to be aligned with God. And you're like, yeah, don't do that. And then it'll head into this natural, not natural thing. You're like, oh, why'd you have to go there? Didn't you know that we as human beings, we're always going to try to gravitate toward the words that give some of us power over others, that creates some kind of worldly order and judgment? And didn't you know that if you wrote that stuff, we would forget the really great words about in Christ there is no male or female or Jew or Greek or slave or free. So I know I've read enough of God and Empire to know that you lift up for us the parts of Paul that are appealing and not appalling. And so we've looked forward to that this morning. Welcome.
So again, is my sound okay? And I've been asked if it is possible between myself and Jorg, or between Jorg and myself before we go up there, if people want to stand up. As far as I'm concerned, you may stand up at any time you want. I will simply consider it a personal standing ovation. So if at any moment you want to stand up. No, seriously, if you do, stand up at the breaks between us when we're adjusting. Going to do two things. I want to talk about Paul, and then at the end I'm going to show you a very special video, and again I'll have Manny turn down the lights and Sarah turn on the projector. Paul. I'm going to make a presumption, since I've only half an hour and sometimes do a whole weekend on Paul, that most of you have had the good literary taste to read the first Paul by Marcus and myself. If you haven't, don't feel guilty, just feel responsible and go do it. Because we have certain problems with Paul. I'm not going to spend the whole time on this. First of all, Paul is writing letters. When you're reading Paul, you're reading somebody else's mail. If you don't understand it, it's your problem. By your, I mean mine. You're reading somebody else's letters. The Corinthians understood exactly what he was saying. That's why it required a second Corinthians. They understood. You're reading a letter. If you don't understand it, you have to try and understand it. Make it a story. In the book, for example, I show you exactly how to read Philemon in great detail to turn a letter into a story, which is the only way you can understand a letter intended for somebody else. Second problem. Page just said it. Half the New Testament, 13 letters attributed to him. Of those, massive consensus, and I'm not going into the details on this, massive consensus that 7 of them come from the historical, real Paul, we call him the first Paul. That is, Romans and Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians and Philemon, and 1st Thessalonians. Don't worry if you don't remember that, it's all in the first Paul. The second set of the other 3, first of all, you have Ephesians, page mentioned Ephesians, Colossians, 2nd Thessalonians, not written by Paul, written after Paul, written against Paul. It's the process of de-radicalization already beginning. That pattern we've seen, I mentioned in the Bible, relentlessly going on to de-radicalize God, Jesus, Paul. The final ones, Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, certainly not written by Paul, but written against Paul. We call it in our book the radical Paul, the conservative Paul, the reactionary Paul. Now that's a consensus worked out by scholars in the last 100 years. It's not political correctness or anything else, not something we invented. What we're insisting on is that Paul is a radical follower of Jesus. And what you have to do with a radical God or a radical Jesus or a radical Paul is de-radicalize them. The great thing about Paul is you can actually watch it happening because the letters are separate. With Jesus, it's already happening in the air as he speaks to the people who hear him. The process of de-radicalization is going on. What I want to do is focus just on one point. Romans. We could fill this church with a library on Romans, especially since the Reformation. Must have been the most difficult thing ever written. Well, how did anyone ever understand it then? How did ordinary people in the first century understand it if it was so difficult? Or did we in the Reformation start asking Paul questions he wasn't even interested in and wasn't his concern? He sent it with Phoebe, a woman, to take it to Rome. Not as a feminist manifesto or anything else. She was just going there, and Paul made no difference one way or the other. So was she the most brilliant theologian the world has ever known, since she had to read the letter? I mean read it. Be able to read it. Do you ever see one of those papyruses of the New Testament? Wall-to-wall writings in capital letters, no breaks. Try it in English even. Makes your head spin. Or is it simple? Could ordinary people understand it? Of course they could, or we wouldn't have it. So we've done something with it. For example, we're touching on one thing already. Paul talks about justice, the justice of God. We said that's about punishment. That's about retributive justice. Then we have to think, how can it be good news that God is a God of punishment? And then we create what I call pretzel theology. To explain why it's good news that God's into punishment. And we come up with substitutionary atonement and all sorts of weird theology to explain a mistake. God is a God of distributive justice. Now, let me kind of grope my way with a couple of metaphors into the heart of Paul. What I'm trying to do in these 3 lectures is what is the most important thing in the Bible about God, about Jesus, about Paul. Think of this metaphor. Think of air, A-I-R, air. First of all, it's sort of transcendent. By transcendent, I simply mean we need it. We can't get on without it. That's what I mean by transcendent. I don't mean it's up there somewhere. I mean it transcends your wishes. You can't simply say, I think I'll do without air today. It's transcendent, but it's also totally immanent. It's everywhere, inside you, outside you. Transcendent, immanent. It has nothing to do with your merits or any discrimination you could possibly think of, female, male, up, down. I won't even go through them all. It's there for everyone. But you can still choose to choke if you want to work at it, or to hyperventilate if that's your pleasure. It doesn't take away your free will. So now let me think. Let's call that process of air airification. The airification of the world. Think justification, but airification of the world. It's a freebie, right? It's a freebie. But it doesn't impose itself on you. You can still choke. You'd have to work at it, but you could do it. So, airification by gift through acceptance. Okay? That's Paul's theology. Justification by grace through faith, or justification through grace by faith. Let me unpack that a little bit. Justification, Greek dikaiosune, is really not a weird Christian concept or a weird Reformation idea that's very difficult to understand. It is, how does God want the world to be made just? How does God want the world to be just? You could use that in the Roman Empire and say justification, and a Roman imperial theologian would say, yeah, that's our program, that's our business. We're in the business of establishing justice. First of all, we have victory. Then after victory, we have peace. And after peace, we get justice. We don't rob you, in other words. We have laws and all the rest of it. So please, by the way, never talk about peace and justice. Always say justice and peace. Peace and justice is the Roman program. We will get peace. And then we'll be just as long as you stay peaceful. The Jesus program is first justice, then peace. Anyway. So justification for Paul is how God wants the world to be just. Well, how is God going to do that? Maybe God's going to pass a law. You've got to be just or I'll punish you. Paul says law doesn't work. And don't think he's talking about Torah. He's talking about all the law you could possibly imagine. Roman law, Jewish law, Christian law, any law. Any law. He's talking about a very simple thing. When you're driving out there and you see a sign that says 55, automatically you don't go to 55. Automatically you don't go to 75 either. It doesn't force you to go to 75, but it doesn't compel you to go to 55. Paul says law is not strong enough. And here's the magnificent, to use my expression again, heartbeat of Paul. God's offered you God's own spirit of justice. It's like air. God's very character of justice, God's very being as just, that is, as distributing fairly to everyone, is offered to you. as a gift, if you will accept it. So all this distribution stuff we're talking about, it's not like a law or a commandment or a warning or anything else. It's a gift of God's own being. Let me try and show you the metaphors that make sense of Paul to me. I'm not using these metaphors to help you understand. I use them to help myself understand, and if they help you, it's a bonus. This is the only way I can understand Paul. Supposing, for example, this didn't happen, but imagine it. I'd met Martin Luther King at the height of the civil rights movement, and he said to me, Dominic, I'm going to give you my spirit. I'm going to give you my spirit. Okay, Martin, so my spirit will be gone, and your spirit will take over my body, as it were. Yeah. Could I get in trouble, Martin, if I had your spirit? Yeah. Could I end up in jail if I had your spirit? Yeah. Could I end up a martyr? Yes. Well, Martin, I love you. Could I have maybe about 10% of your spirit? I'm afraid of it. But it's a free gift, Dominic. It's free. It's nothing to do with your merits. I'm giving it to you. This is Paul's vision of God. It's not about a law or commandment or anything else. It's about a gift of God's own very character, God's own very being. That, says Paul, is the only thing powerful enough. This is, of course, a different way simply of saying collaborative eschatology. It's the same thing. Let me give you another example. As you see, Sarah and I use Apple all the time. And the reason we do that is very simple. Way back in '85, when we were making our first decisions about computers, as we do in all major decisions, we went to the Bible and looked up PC and couldn't find it anywhere. So Apple was mentioned a half dozen times, so we went with God. Now, supposing I turn on my computer some morning and I get a flash on the screen. Dominic, because Apple knows everywhere, knows where I am. Dominic, we're going to give you a free download of our brand new top secret operating system. Do you have any questions? Oh yeah, I have a few questions. If I download this new and I know when you download a new operating system, you really can't say, well, I didn't like it after the first week, I'd like the old one back. I've tried that and it doesn't work very well. Okay, so I have a question. After I download your new operating system, thank you very much for the offer, by the way, after I download it, will I be able to see everything? Will the videos still work exactly the way they are and everything else in there, gigabytes of stuff? Yes, everything will remain exactly the same, but you'll see it differently. Do you have any questions? That's really what we're imagining. Think of God's own Spirit. We say Spirit, the Holy Spirit. What makes the Spirit holy, of course, is the spirit of fairness, equity, distribution. God's Spirit is offered to us as a free download. Another image, it's like a heart transplant. We all know what a heart transplant is. Your old heart is gone, and please God, if everything works, your new heart will work, and you won't reject it, we hope. But you can't get the old one back if you prefer it. And of course, rejection is possible. So think, when Paul is talking about is a spirit transplant. And what stops rejection of the new spirit is prayer, of course, and liturgy, of course, and practice, above all else. So Paul's whole vision is of God's own very being, nature, character, any terms you want, not necessarily anthropomorphic. And God offers this to everyone. It's a freebie. Paul's word for the freebie, he doesn't use the word freebie, he uses the word charis in Greek, or grace. Grace. It's a freebie. That's what it means. A grace is a gift. Now, by the way, Roman imperial theology considers victory a grace. She's got wings. She's always winged, Victoria, because she comes wherever Jupiter sends her. She comes now, fortunately, only to Rome, but that's up to Jupiter. So she's winged. She's a grace. So with Paul, the justice of God is offered as a spirit transplant, as a free download, any metaphors you want to make, freely. It's offered to everyone. There's no discrimination. But you never lose the right to say no. It's like air. You can always choke. Now, there are consequences. Don't call them punishments, but consequences. Don't say the air punishes you if you decide to choke. So, justification is God's gift of God's own self, given as a freebie, to be accepted by us or rejected. That's our freedom. And don't think that faith, when we hear the word faith, we've almost brought it down to just acceptance of a bunch of weird propositions. If it sounds absurd and you believe it, that must be faith. But think of all the other words. We use faithful. If you were told that, did you see the movie about so-and-so? It's about a faithful dog. What do you imagine? It's about a faithful dog. Maybe the person was sick and the dog went out and helped and got the police or the ambulance. Or we wouldn't be thinking that the dog believed that's my master. The dog must have done something. Faithful, fidelity, all the other words have to do with action. Think of that heart transplant. Supposing you went to a doctor and the doctor said, very serious news, you're going to really need a heart transplant almost immediately. You wouldn't say, well, yeah, I believe that. Yeah, you're probably right, doctor. Have a nice day. You probably would say, I believe it, meaning, is it Monday morning? Or when can I do it? Or how fast can it be done? Or what's going to happen? So, think of my airification, free for all, for anyone, but you have to do it. Paul's justification, by grace, faith. When you think about it, it's absolutely simple. But then, of course, what Paul says, and if you want to see how it works, check out Jesus. Ouch. Ouch. Paul's theology is ferociously simple. Simple to understand, I understand. It is not difficult to understand. It is just terribly difficult to accept. And so we make it difficult to understand so we don't have to face the problem of acceptance. But at least give Paul and give Jesus and give the biblical God the honor of saying, I know what you're saying, I just don't have the guts to do it. Don't say they're saying something else. That is really dishonorable. I want to conclude by showing you a video. And in a way, it's about something else. It's about the resurrection. But here's my point. In the Western tradition of the resurrection, we have Jesus coming out of the tomb, and Jesus looks gorgeous. Sometimes he looks like an athlete coming out of the gym. I spend an hour in the gym every day, and that look of narcissistic testosterone is one I know real well. But he's always coming out alone. Gorgeous, but alone. In the Eastern tradition of Christianity, across the last 1,300 years, Jesus never arises alone. Behind him comes out a whole host of people. Some of them are recognizable, some of them are not. But he never rises alone. Sarah and I have been in Coptic churches, in Greek Orthodox churches, in Syriac monasteries, and we see the same pattern again and again and again. It shows what they call the anastasis. Now we're talking about the resurrection. We're not talking about what in the Western tradition we tucked away on Holy Saturday as the harrowing of hell. The robbing of hell. Something to keep Jesus busy on Saturday so he doesn't get bored. He's had a terrible day on Friday, he's going to have a busy day on Sunday, and on Saturday he goes down to Hades to have a chat, apparently. And we don't know what to do with it. We really don't, because the resurrection for us is all about Jesus. Or maybe about us too, but about Jesus. But wait a minute. If we're talking about the justice of God, and it just starts with Jesus, how is that justice? What about the huge backlog of injustice that's been there before Jesus? He's not the first Jew who died on a Roman cross. He's not the first Jewish martyr. So there has to be a huge peace and reconciliation commission with all of human history almost. You can't bracket the past and Jesus come out of the tomb as some kind of nepotism or filiotism, God taking care of God's own son, and to heck with everyone else. The Jewish thinking about this has been retained better. No, the Jewish thinking about this has been retained in the Eastern tradition and not in the Western tradition, and it is our most profound loss. I'm going to show you a video. I don't want to interrupt it, so let me just explain what you're going to see. I want to show you just a few images first of the Western tradition that we all know, and how in the Western tradition we have separated the harrowing of hell when Jesus goes down and takes all those who have died before him out of hell from the resurrection. We kind of got them separated, and then we tucked the descent into hell, or whatever we call it, away theologically. In the Eastern tradition, they're the same. Again and again, across these images, it says, He Anastasis, the resurrection. There's 4 stages, 4 separate stages in the history of the Eastern tradition on the resurrection. I code them with 4 words. The first word is bending. You're going to see Jesus bending down like this, to the left or to the right, doesn't make any difference, depends on the artist. He's holding the hand of Adam and Eve. He's taking them right out of the tomb, holding the hand. And he's bending down. There'll be 6 recognizable characters. The first 2 are Adam and Eve. Now, I doubt if there's a single person in Western Christianity, if you said, all right, Jesus is taking 2 people out with him. Who are they? I don't think we'd have come up with Adam and Eve. Because if Adam and Eve are there, who ain't? The next 2 recognizable people are David and Solomon. And theologians say, well, that's because David wrote the Psalms and Solomon wrote the wisdom. I don't think so. I think it's who's paying for all this stuff. Of course. Kings are paying for it. We want some of us in there. Get some of our money back. The other 2, though, there's 6 recognizable ones. And in terms chronologically, Adam and Eve, David and Solomon. And you recognize David and Solomon. They'll both have crowns. David will be bearded. Solomon will be unbearded, younger. And you recognize Adam, of course, long beard. And Eve is always very young, looking like Mary. The other 2 that are always there are Abel, the first martyr of the Old Testament. I'd never have thought of that. First martyr of the Old Testament, John the Baptist, the first martyr of the New Testament. So the martyrs of time and place. But the 4 steps, the first one is bending. The second one I call leaving. Jesus is still holding on to Adam. It's like, we're out of here. And the whole crowd are coming out after Jesus. The third one I call facing. He's still holding on to Adam. They're all going out, and he's looking at you. Okay? And the 4th stage, and it is the 4th stage, which is the one I really love, it's what I call it two-handed, equal opportunity yanking. He's got Adam in one hand and Eve with the other, and he's yanking them out of the tomb. Eve is not just standing with Adam, each of them like that. But I want you to watch that. Watch the fact the cross is always in his hand, so they never separate crucifixion and resurrection. He's kind of standing on the gates of hell, bifold gates that are across like that. And Hades, who's like the doorman, is kind of getting trodden on. He's like, the doors have been smashed in, and there's rocks, there's bolts all over the place. What I really want you to do is just look at the images. Sear them into your imagination. Think of the different religious sensibility that's there. In the West, we can easily get into big arguments about, well, if you had a photographer right in front of the tomb on Easter Sunday morning, could you have seen Jesus coming out? To which the answer is, CNN couldn't, but Fox News could. Of course, because Fox News sees all sorts of stuff the rest of us can't see, so it's quite simple. But if you try and imagine this huge group of people rising with Jesus, how could they be thinking literally? Or the tombs would be empty all around Jerusalem. It must be a different vision. But what's at stake in this is you cannot have justice for the future without facing the injustice of the past. You can say, well, that doesn't help people. At least you must admit that all those who have died from injustice or for justice were right. So let me show you this. It'll take me a second to boot up. Watch then the 4 stages. Watch for that. Watch for the 6 people that you'll be expecting. You'll always know Adam because he's holding the hand. And I want you to think about that. Jesus isn't just standing there speaking to them. He's really, in the Eastern tradition, he's holding them. He's pulling them out. Adam and Eve, recognize them. Recognize David and Solomon. We'll show you in one case when the rest we'll just let you understand it. Abel and John the Baptist. And sort of ask yourself, if we were asked to imagine other people coming out with Jesus, who would we have come up with? And why wouldn't we have come up with them as the ones? Okay, let's take a look. By the way, I love that little image I used of Jesus this morning. Did you notice that? When it's from a 4th century gilded plate in the British Museum. I love about it is you cannot really tell whether Jesus was female or male if you didn't see the Christus. But you know he's having a lovely hair day. He's got beautiful curls back there. I'm going to begin this one with an image of Paul. And it's again a 4th century image, late 4th century image of Paul. It's only 4 inches high. It'll look much bigger up there. It's 4 inches high. And it's really the handle for a lamp. It's not Paul all gold and everything else. It's just a handle for a little Christian lamp. If you'd like to stand in place for just 1 second as Jorg is coming up here.
Very well, let me continue with the last segment of our lectures for this morning. There was a question this morning that was raised to me twice by two different people, and I think it's a good one for us to keep in the back of our minds. And this had to do with me talking about bottom-up movements, and I'll talk more about this in the upcoming lecture. But the question was, if you're so happy about bottom-up movements, what about the Tea Party? Which appears at first sight, for sure, to be a bottom-up movement. The question, of course, with all of these bottom-up movements is who drives it, what drives it, and who benefits from it. If you look at the Tea Party, I think this is an interesting question. Are the people actually benefiting from it? If somebody who has no health care goes up to protest against universal health care, who benefits from this? Does the person benefit? Does the community benefit? Or somebody else? And who has an interest in these messages getting spread around? In my own German heritage, of course, we had other bottom-up movements. Fascism is one. The people standing up for certain things that apparently the people care about. But the question still is, who benefits and who doesn't? Who gets hurt and whose interests get perpetuated? Keep that in the back of your mind as I go on with this lecture, and I'd be happy to discuss this question again at the end. So maybe not every bottom-up movement by default is the right sort of bottom-up movement. In this lecture, ending our morning session, I want to talk about empire and resistance, reshaping desire from the bottom up. Now, whether you talk about religion or economics, desire is a key problem. But what I want to explore in the next 30 minutes is whether it really reaches the bottom of what we're dealing with, or whether the problem goes deeper than we are usually led to believe. If you look at the sorts of things that we commonly blame in our current situation, like consumerism, greed, envy, jealousy, and so on. I wonder if those are the things that go deep enough, that really help us understand what the problem is, or whether we'd have to dig a little bit deeper yet. Martin Luther, in a famous explanation of what it means to have God or to believe in God, put it this way. He said, "God is that to which your heart clings and entrusts itself." God is that to which your heart clings and entrusts itself. Or, God is that which we desire. So desire has a deep impact here. It pushes to what we connect with God. And it may look like this is the problem of consumerism, right? Consumers want more and more stuff. And so on the surface, it looks like this stuff then becomes their God. But is consumerism really about stuff? Or is it about something deeper? The desire for a new car may not ultimately be the desire for a new mode of transportation. But it may be the desire of a feeling of security, of being cared for, of being, ensconced in luxury. Deeper than simply the desire for 2 tons of steel. The desire for deeper values. The desire for a new cell phone may not be simply the desire for a new electronic gadget. And even if it's an iPhone, apologies to Apple, it may not be that. It may be the deeper desire to be heard. Can you hear me now? Somebody listening to me? The freedom to communicate, the freedom to feel connected to others. So the interesting question is, what's up with desire? Is it simply desire for stuff, or is something else going on? Many economists and theologians assume that desire is simply there. It's something that's given. Keeping up with the Joneses is something that we all want to achieve. But this is what I want to question here a little bit. Desire may not be as natural as we think it is. One way to make that case is to look at the fact that we're all personally encountering between 300, that's a low estimate, and 3,000, that's a high estimate, of advertisements every day. What is this advertising business all about? Is it simply about informing us about the products that are out there? Or might it have something to do with shaping our desires and keeping our desires functioning well? Economist John Kenneth Galbraith talked about the diminishing urgency of wants and desires. The diminishing urgency of wants and desires. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. Who really needs more than just a couple of cars, or a couple of houses, or a couple of candy bars, or a couple of anything? Once you've had a few houses, once you've had a few cars, perhaps there is indeed this diminishing urgency of wants and desires. So it's not surprising that the desires of consumers have to be produced in order to keep the economy going. This idea of the consumer-driven economy is really a myth. It's another story that empire and dominant economics want us to believe, that ultimately the consumers are in charge. They want it. They want a new car every 2 years. They want a new gadget every couple of months. They want a new cell phone every 18 months, or whatever the statistics tell us. Desire, this is my first point here, is something that gets produced for us. It's something that shapes us very deeply. This is another example of how empire and economics shape us without us ever knowing it. And it's not just about stuff. It's about ultimate values, love, feeling appreciated, feeling secure. That's what we're dealing with. Desire that is produced goes very deep. It's aimed ultimately to shape us to the bottom of our existence, and it is designed to shape us for life. If you can imprint children with these things for life, you have made it. Your business is going to succeed. Unfortunately, in the church, we too often don't see how deep these desires go. And so the sort of solutions that we have by simply indicting consumerism, by simply moralizing about these things, doesn't really help anybody. The problem here is not just ethics. The problem is theology. So what we need is a better strategy for reshaping desire. How do we do that? If you go back to the gospel of prosperity for a moment, you might wonder, what is the problem here? Some people have said, well, it's simply too materialistic. It's talking about stuff instead of spiritual values. Well, maybe the problem is not that it's talking about material stuff. The Bible does so throughout, especially the Old Testament. The question is, what kind of stuff are we talking about? What kind of relation to the material reality is promised here? And if you look at it, it's not just stuff in general. It's the desire for more and more. It's the desire to make it up the ladder. It's the desire for the fulfillment of all potential desires that we might ever have. It seems to me, though, that this sort of desire leads us to a false God. That's Luther's warning. God is that to which your heart clings and entrusts itself. The gospel of prosperity and a lot of mainline Christianity makes us cling to the desires that are put in place for us by status quo economics. Mainline Christianity may be part of the problem here rather than part of the solution. What I want to suggest here in reshaping desire is we have to look at two different approaches to the material world. There's a difference between what our desires suggest we need and what our real needs are. Because desires are potentially unlimited, and the advertising industry and the people behind it will make sure that it will keep going and going and going, even when the natural urgency of desire has long diminished. Desire is unlimited, but needs are not. And so perhaps we can start reshaping desire in the context of comparing them to our actual needs. Here's something we can learn again from the key Judeo-Christian traditions. Finding God ultimately in these traditions is not happening in this world of unlimited desires. It's not happening at the top of the food chain. Finding God in our Judeo-Christian traditions often happens in places of great struggle and great need. Finding what really matters here happens in situations of need. I'll give you two examples. And in some ways, this is wonderful how our presentations overlap, because I want to come back to Moses. We heard about Moses yesterday. And if for a moment you remind yourself who he was, a Hebrew boy raised as an Egyptian prince who had all the desires available to him, and of course, a lot of fulfillment of his desires at his fingertips. But there's a turning point in the Moses story. And the turning point is not the burning bush. In Exodus, we read this one passage. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating one of his kinsfolk. Perhaps this is the story of Moses moving from a world of unlimited desire to a world of need, seeing the people struggling. And of course, you know how the story unfolds. He overreacts a bit, has to go underground. But it is in this situation that God speaks to him. This is the situation when God speaks to him out of the burning bush. And what they're talking about there is not abstract, happy religious revelation. They're talking about the liberation of the people from Egypt. So the religious story here takes place in a context of someone recognizing the real needs of people. Moving from the world of desire to the world of needs, and all kinds of things happen. Getting in touch with the needs of people is the turning point here. And the religious revelation happens in relation to that. It's always tied back to those real needs of the people. If you tell the Moses story without this context, it's no wonder it seems irrelevant and boring. God speaks out of a burning bush. So what? What's the big deal, right? I mean, I can see my teenagers asking this question. What's the point of God speaking out of burning bushes? It doesn't happen all the time anyway. It's probably not going to happen to you. It never happened to me either. Maybe there's a different point here. It's not God speaking out of burning bushes. It's God somehow addressing the needs of the people and those who struggle to meet them. Here you have Moses. The other example, of course, for Christians is the Jesus tradition. Again, I'm prepared to argue that the Jesus tradition makes no sense unless you really see it in terms of addressing the needs of the people. Just like Moses learned a few things by joining the labor movement in Egypt. Don't forget, Moses is a very early labor organizer. That's what we're talking about here. Just like Moses learned a few things by joining the labor movement and the real needs of people, Jesus must have learned a few things from working in construction with Joseph. Not you pay attention to stuff that you wouldn't pay attention otherwise. How about this one? You recognize the passage from the Gospel of Luke. The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one at the table? But I am among you as one who serves, says Jesus. There's a radical reversal taking place here from the unlimited world of desire, the one sitting at the table, to the world of need of those who serve. This is that top-down, bottom-up reversal that I keep talking about. And it has some serious consequences. Jesus' parables all make a lot more sense if read from this bottom-up perspective. They talk about common people all the time. Working people, shepherds, service workers, people working in vineyards, in agriculture, fishermen. The list continues. Reading those traditions from the bottom up rather than from the top down is key. The difference here between desires and needs is something that we have to keep in the back of our minds. And it matches this other sort of movement on the other side of my diagram here that goes from reality to the real. Reality differs from the real, like desire differs from needs. The needs form the bedrock of our humanity. Of course, you know the basic needs, right? Food, shelter, and clothing. But then I would add to this list sanitation, education, healthcare, and this ability to be productive that I discussed in the morning. The ability to make work, to work constructively, to contribute to building something. Those are our needs. Unfortunately, those sorts of needs are not seen when we talk about reality. When we talk about reality, I think this is the thing that usually resembles the world of desires. The desire for a new car, for instance, which is often seen as that's reality. Keeping up with the Joneses, that's reality. But that desire for a new car may not have to do with our deeper needs. Keeping up with the Joneses may not have to do with our real needs as humans. The odd thing is that what we call reality is usually the sort of thing that most people agree on. That's what really matters. That's what really goes down. Reality is what we're taught to think the world is like. It's what we call common sense. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that desires are just part of human nature. What happens, though, when we contrast this sort of reality, this sort of common sense with our real human needs? The difference between reality and the real here needs to be taken into account, because too often empire tells us this is the way things are, there is no reality, there is no alternative, that's reality. What I'm saying is there's something else going on, and perhaps we could call this the real. The question again is, how do we reshape desire? We reshape it by comparing desires and real needs, by making a distinction between reality, that's the way it is, and the real. There's a difference if you look at economic processes that are based on desire and based on needs. Economic processes based on desire usually focus on the production and sale of more and more stuff. We have to keep our economy humming. The most patriotic activity then becomes shopping, right? That's what we're told after September 11. You have to go shopping to keep the economy humming. Economy based on desire is an economy that keeps growing and growing, keeps bubbling, keeps producing more and more bubbles, which eventually, of course, burst. There you have your reality. It keeps bursting, keeps exploding, it keeps vanishing. And even your 401k plans may be part of this reality, bursting, some of them already having gone through that process. An economy based on need, on the other hand, takes what I call production more seriously. It takes the sort of perspective from people who actually do the work. The goal here is not the infinite maximization of profit. The goal here is simply to be able to do creative work, to contribute to something that's meaningful, to make a difference. The goal here is to become a creative participant in the world. And this economy based on need allows for solidarity. It's not based on competition. It's not a zero-sum game where my success blots out your success, where my gain is your loss. It's the sort of real that we're not really considering at the moment. It's a work with dignity, people joining hands together. Here, the distinction between reality and the real is useful. Reality is the sort of thing promoted by mainline economics, based on all-consuming desire that has to be ratcheted up through advertising, through enticing us to buy more and more, to want more and more. The real, on the other hand, is a different sort of economy that moves from the bottom up. And what I'm saying here really is that perhaps an economy based on the real could help us produce healthier desires. Desires are not a bad thing, but the question is, who controls them? How are they produced? And how can we reshape them? There's a different sort of power at work here in those two models. There's the top-down model, which is the classical one. This is the traditional empire model. It is the traditional economic model that we are confronted with in our own time. It is God sitting at the top, controlling everything, running the show. The God of the successful, of the powerful, of the ones who are making money, who are increasing their capacity for desire and for basically fulfilling their desires. This is the God to which our heart clings and entrusts itself, according to Luther. A lot of religion and economics today takes this top-down shape. I've talked about this in all three lectures, so I think it's pretty clear what I mean here. There is no alternative. This is the way it has to be. God located on the side of unlimited desire and what we consider reality to be. There is no alternative. That's the way it is. And every rational person, every realist knows this is what it is. But what I've tried to put before you in these lectures is there is indeed an alternative. There is something else going on here. I call it bottom-up power. And this is the sort of power that gets manifested throughout our Judeo-Christian traditions. And perhaps this is the miracle that we're dealing with as progressive Christians. Having an image of top-down power is no surprise. This is the way the world goes. This is the way the empire has always been run. And that religion follows suit is quite normal. No surprise here. You should expect it. The surprise, the miracle in all of this is that we have maintained these bottom-up visions at the same time. This is where your alternative is going to come from. And this is the sort of religion that is a lot more difficult to explain and to explain away. Top-down religion is fairly easy to understand. But this bottom-up religion that won't go away, that keeps making trouble, that keeps providing alternatives, that is the sort of thing that I marvel at and that I think is the real miracle that we have to think through, and that keeps us going. The title of our series for this weekend mentions savage inequality. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, why are things out of whack? Why do we have this savage inequality? Why do we have this increasing gap between the rich and the poor? Seems to me it is because we keep worshipping top-down power. We keep preferring top-down power over bottom-up power. Because we value desires over needs. And because we're so much taught and trained to believe in reality over against what is real. Religion, to be sure, has been co-opted here. It too now functions at the level of desire, the gospel of prosperity just being the most blatant example. Religion too now functions top-down at the desire level without grounding us in real needs. But this is where the Judeo-Christian traditions make a difference, pushing us perhaps to consider, to listen to the beat of a different drummer. God's power is at work. It seems to me, this is one thing we can argue, we can give a lot more examples for, is at work from the bottom up and not from the top down. I'm not arguing both ends. I'm not saying, well, we can have it both ways, because if you try that, guess which perspective wins? It's an old game, right? Let's just balance the two. Let's have it both ways. Well, you try having it both ways, and the bigger magnet always wins. What we consider the greater power. What we're talking about, whether it's the Moses story, whether it's the Jesus story, or whether it's the story of the Apostle Paul, is there is a real alternative. We have this option to value needs over desires, the real over reality. Just to give you one famous quotation from the Apostle Paul, which we have just discussed, at the beginning of the letter to the Corinthians. This is the passage that made no sense to me at all as a seminarian in Germany. None of my teachers could ever explain it either. But here it is, 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 28. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters, says Paul. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world. Well, that preaches, right? God chose what is foolish in the world. And usually you can wing it for a Sunday on that one. Not on the next part of that sentence. God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God shows what is weak in the world. Again, that can preach, not the other part. To shame the strong. God shows what is low and despised in the world. Things that are not, to reduce to nothing. Things that are. So there's a tension here. There's a conflict. There's a struggle. Progressives sometimes shy away from conflict and struggle, but it might well pay off here to talk about this difference between God, who chooses the weak to shame the strong, who chooses those who are foolish in order to shame the wise, who stands on the side of that which is low and despised in the world in order to reduce to nothing things that are. So here again, we're back at the question, where is God in all of this? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a German martyr in the resistance struggle against fascism, once talked about following God where God had already preceded us. If you want to look for God, you might have to look for God in those places where God's actually doing work. If you're looking for God, you might have to look for God in the trenches, people struggling for survival in the empire, rather at the top levels of it. If you're looking for God in this economy, you might have to look for God at the place where people are organizing, where people are trying to survive, where people are trying to have not only their voices heard, but also their labor count. And as we know, labor counts less and less these days. Where is God here? In places where real alternatives emerge, where real stuff is happening. The good news is that this has been going on throughout history. In the United States, we've had these movements. I talked about them last night. Those are great reminders that what I'm talking about are not just a couple of good ideas, not just a couple of pious wishes of a theologian who has this idea that the world might be different. We do have evidence that this difference keeps bubbling up. It cannot be suppressed. In our own time, we may have lost hope in some ways, but it seems to me things are happening all around us. And perhaps you're living in a place in this world here in LA, in the LA area, where a lot more things are happening at the moment than where I come from in Dallas, Texas. I know here you have clergy and laity united for economic justice. You have progressive Christians uniting. You have various other networks and movements. You have Jobs with Justice at work in this city. You're at the heart of some of the budding labor and religion movement. You have Chet Myers' Bartimaeus Institute talking about Sabbath economics. I mean, think about the sorts of things that are already happening all around us. The next step would be, how do we bring these things back together again? How do we stop fighting simply as individuals, doing our own projects, trying to perhaps, perpetuate our own ideas rather than the bigger real on which it all is based. LA may become a place, a lab bench where you can do these things, where these things might happen in such a way that they become an example, that they really set a precedent, set the stage for what's going to happen next. However, it is a bottom-up perspective. It is not about the people who stand at the lecterns. It's not about the people who have the big ideas. It's not even about the great labor leaders. It is about the people who come together, who provide the energy. And the whole thing then becomes bigger than us. This is what liberals sometimes forget. This is not just about us doing good work. This is about the heart of reality. This is about not just what would Jesus do, but what is Jesus doing now? And I, for one, have a very hard time that Jesus is simply upholding the status quo. I think there's something else at the heart of reality. And I believe it really pays to explore and to keep asking these questions. So thanks for being here, asking these questions with us. I expect to learn more in subsequent conversations. At this point, let me invite Don back up to the podium. You might feel this is another time for a break if you want to just stand up and relax a little. Thank you.
Dom talked about the aeration, and I love that image of God's free gift given to all. Bridge, either of you can address this, or both of you can address this, bridge that to the bottom-up proposition. Bridge that to the bottom-up proposition. How does that aeration assist, empower, inspire bottom-up activity? Either of you.
The way I understand this notion of justification when Paul talks about it, like what you were saying, is it is in direct competition with the Roman notion of justice. So we have an alternative system of justice, and we have something that's already moving. This is not just something you have to invent and to have to institute from the top down, but it's already there with the people. It's already there like you breathe in. It's just we're not looking in the right places for it. So there's some air available to us. I don't know if that image works. Some oxygen, some fresh air. We might just have to open a window every now and then for it, let it in.
Yeah, I think top down, bottom up, either way is a vertical model. I think when we're talking collaboration or covenant, we're talking about a bilateral horizontal. Did I get that right? Horizontal model. I think it might even be dangerous, so I've used the expression myself, bottoms up, against the tops down. I think collaboration and covenant and bilateral terms are really horizontal model. So I think that's much more important. It's collaboration.
The issue, though, and I think we have to at some point address what we're up against, because if you look at these struggles that the labor movements, the civil rights movements, and so on fought, they had to fight these struggles against some dominant powers that would not just say, well, okay, let's collaborate now. There were some problems that had to be deconstructed first. Yeah. There were some privileged positions, some wise people, some powerful people, some people that thought they controlled knowledge, they controlled wisdom. Were some of these positions that had to be deconstructed in such a way that it was even possible to collaborate.
Then maybe the danger is that we're seeing that, okay, because I agree with that completely, I really do. But when we're dealing with God, then we have to reverse that model to a horizontal model. Because if we take that bottoms up, the danger is then, of course, it's bottoms up for God too. So God's up there. So I think it's perfectly right. The movement that Jesus does or Paul does is really working from the bottoms up against the Roman Empire. But I think both of them imagine that you're collaborating with God. So maybe we have to think in crosshairs. It's quite all right to do the bottom top in terms of what you're against, because they're imposing that model on you. So you can't ignore it and say, we'll just collaborate with it. That would be naive. But then the danger is if we're thinking the same way, then God's the real top. And then I think the message I'm getting from the language of Paul is participation, the language is in Christ. It's all a very mutual style of language. So when you're dealing with that, I'd want to keep the horizontal, I think.
All right then. We'll continue privately. Paul.
Okay, my name is Paul Kim, a clergy member, United Methodist Church. I have a question about non-violence. You presented about a non-violent Jesus this morning. I'm a non-violent person too. But we need to think about a situation ethic, especially Bonhoeffer, Lutheran minister, tried to assassinate Hitler because Nazism killed so many, 6 million Jewish people. Please imagine you have 3 children here. All of us are going to kill you because of the lands. How do you want to take an action in Christian responsibility or Christian situation, ethic?
Okay. Do I start that, sir? Okay, let me start on that. I'm not saying this now directly to you, but we have to be very, very careful about that argument in terms of nonviolent resistance. Because again and again we get the exact example like that. All right, you're seeing somebody here who's battering a child to death. The only way you can stop that is by using violence. Do you use violence? My answer is yes. But I've never claimed to be a pacifist. What I'm asking us to see is that violence now has escalated to the point that it threatens the human species. And there are some times, I can understand the argument, and I would agree with it. If the only way you can defend your life, do you have the right to kill? Yes, you do. If enemies land on our actual beaches, do we have the right to defend ourselves? Yes, we do. But none of that gets to the point that the human species is now endangered by violence. And unless we, the human species, decides that violence is no longer tolerable, as we decided about slavery, that we are a doomed species. And that's reality. Because violence has escalated. If violence had simply stayed as a sort of an unfortunate thing like bad weather, we could say, well, we have to live with it and that's the way it is. But from the time, say, of the Romans, for comparison, it's not gone like that, it's gone like that. It took us only 3,000 years to get from an iron sword to a hydrogen bomb. We're smart and getting smarter. So that's the way I want to pose the question. It's not the question, can I defend my life? Or if my beloved Sarah says, of course I will defend it. Well, I will. And I will not judge. And I certainly will not judge Bonhoeffer. I do wish that in 1923 in the beer hall Putz, the guy who was shot right next to Hitler, that God had just intervened a little bit and moved, just, 2 feet move, and we wouldn't know anything about it, and God would have got away with it, and we'd no problem with an interventionist God. Yeah, I just wish the policeman had taken out Hitler. Yeah. But my problem that we have to face is violence threatening the human species, and how can we get it under control? That's my question.
I guess another way to respond to this is simply to say, can you fight empire with the methods of empire? If empire methods are violent, top-down, is this the only way to fight it, or is there another way to do it? The problem with talking about nonviolence in our context is that too often it means like we're just stepping back from the problem. We're not going to get involved. Yeah, we're going to stay somewhere in the middle. That's not an option in this situation where violence has increased and where the pressures on us have increased.
Yeah. It's nonviolent resistance you're talking about.
It's resistance. That is the emphasis here. Yes.
Our question about social institutions. So religion is a social institution, government is a social institution, the economy is a social institution. the anthropologist Mary Douglas, just 2 points. One is if people are having an argument about something important, like justice, they're probably having social institutions think and speak through their argument. Secondly, in the quest for dominance, one institution that dominates will want to think for the others. Prosperity Christianity being an example. Okay, my question. Resistance, it implies being against. And obviously it's being against false images of government, false images of the economy. Okay, my question, though, is can there be a dialogue between the social institutions? Does resistance imply dialogue? And with the idea of dialogue being autonomy, respect, listening. So my question, can there be a dialogue, but then, if so, what would be the common ground for the dialogue?
Any volunteers?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there needs to be a dialogue. Otherwise, what you have is just, raw power deciding the day, and that's the empire method. Of course, when you talk about institutions, you have some alternatives. There are different types of institutions, and I don't agree that every institution necessarily has to be structured like an empire. If you look at churches, there are different ways of structuring, organizing churches that show very different images of power, and of course have very different images of God behind it. Now, once you bring those together, of course, dialogue gets difficult, because if you have a very authoritarian institution, how do you dialogue with that, right? On the other hand, you have people that always want a dialogue, but they may be afraid to stand up for something. They're just so interested in pleasing people and being agreeable and not to have a fight that nothing happens. So what's the sort of common ground? Well, I'd say for me the question is, how do we talk about how this benefits the least of these? And then you can have your dialogue, and everybody around the room has to show how their model actually benefits the least of these. Make dominant economics show this. Not just give us an idea that a rising tide will lift all boats. Give us some numbers. Show us where this thing actually has improved our lives. So in that sense, you can have a dialogue, but I think in the dialogue, it will become very clear who is of what nature when you look at it in terms of the margins.
We have to go a little bit speedily here, so
we
I'm going to...
We promised to alternate genders,
Yes.
so I'd like to take the lady.
Would you please, yes.
Okay, my question is going to ask you to return to the discussion about top-down or bottom-up. And you clarified that it's not a both and. But I think the collaboration element works in here because I guess my fear is that if God is in the trenches, or if we look to the suffering of the world as the creative force of shaping the world, then we develop in the place of an empirical theology, a theology that depends on the bottom existing, on the trenches and the suffering existing. And it's a thread of thought that's, important in liberation theology, but I'm wondering what you would say. Where do we find God when there are no more trenches?
The most difficult question here is talking about taking sides, and usually we want to be fair and not take sides too quickly, but it seems in these liberation struggles you will not go anywhere without taking sides. A very easy example, of course, is from a family perspective. If you're raising kids, you come home and you see the big kid beating up the little kid. You're going to take sides or not? Well, you're probably going to take sides in such a way that you stand on the side defending the kid that gets beaten up, showing your love for that kid that way. Mm-hmm. But the more interesting question is, what about the big kid? By stopping the violence, by stepping in, by taking sides, are you loving that kid or not? Mm. And the thing is, you're loving that kid because you're preventing him or her, probably a guy, right? Big boy, from self-destructive behavior, helping that person to become more fully human. So, simply talking about God being on everybody's side, loving everybody equally, is not helping anyone, because it perpetuates self-destructive behavior by those who oppress, and it perpetuates situations of suffering. So the reason for talking about taking sides is to overcome suffering, not to dwell in the suffering or to become a masochist where you enjoy that sort of thing now. And it is the call for conversion, for change, for transformation, for those who are in power. So in that sense, God responds to everybody. That is the big insight here, is not just taking sides and then forgetting about the others. But in the struggle, something gets worked out that needs to be worked out. If you're right about these power structures, these power diversions becoming bigger and bigger, this is what we're up against. An empire will not necessarily back down by itself, simply because we argue for collaboration.
Yeah.
Can we have the last question, because we're short on time? Rob?
Thank you. In the top-down discussion, I really bought into the desire versus need, but I was a bad boy, and during the reality real part, I Googled the definition of reality and real. And the dictionaries of the world do make no differentiation between them. So I would suggest we put a modifier to reality, maybe manufactured or empire reality or something, because you lost me definitionally and the dictionary didn't help.
Well, it all depends, of course. Dictionaries are made by empires, by status quo language. So, but I'll give you a really quick response. I mean, this sort of search happens all over the map. It's fairly common. Take of psychoanalysis, for instance. That's a language that we know. The person on the couch talking about their reality, telling a nice story. The analyst sitting slightly behind that person is making notes about the real. Well, the real there is what you have repressed. The sort of stuff that really drives you, that you can't see, but it's there, Reality is what we think it is. The real is the sort of analytical moment when you look at what's really going on below the surface. And we make those distinctions all the time. Psychoanalysis is just one example, but look at sociological studies, anthropological studies. What I'm saying for theology is we probably do a better job if we looked slightly below the surface for a change, because too often we simply buy into what people accept as the status quo. And so maybe we need to define it more, but that's the struggle, I think, that we're really facing, and that's a common one.
Saying exactly the same thing, different language then. The crosshairs of Matrix from last night. Remember the crosshairs? Tradition, vision. Tradition, from Latin traditum, the things given. By tradition, I simply meant what you're told is reality. This is the way it is. We all know it. It's the traditum. The vision is some person or group who has a paradigm shift or a different way of seeing the tradition or moving it around. Those are the crosshairs of Matrix. Tradition, vision, time and place. You can't take them out of any matrix.
Wonderfully done. Now, let me thank you again and say very briefly what's about to happen at lunch. You are going to get a taste of some very good food. You're also going to get a taste of something that we call conversations around the table. You will be, you have a number on your badge. I invite you to go to that table. That means that you will be separated for a brief moment from people you know well, but it's good for you. It's good for you. You will also have at each table a person who is to be the facilitator and scribe. Some tables will have people who are already designated as that. If you do not have one, elect one immediately, or someone self-select, because we need to do this rather speedily. So there'll be tables of 8. If you have numbers 22 to 26, find a space at a table that's open and join that table. It'll balance out very nicely. We will provide each table with a sheet so that we can extract from you, not in an empire way, but in a gentle way, extract from you your views of an immediate crisis we face in the state of California. That will form the substance for some bottom-up theology we do together in the concluding session. So please Let us say that the lunches are graced, that the occasion is graced. Go get yourself a lunch, find your table, and get talking about the struggle in front of us. Thank you so much.